From today, painting is dead. French artist Paul Delaroche. This is the end of art. I am glad I have had my day. English artist J.M.W. Turner. Both of these proclamations of doom were reactions to the first public exhibitions of photographs in 1839. The emergence of the medium of photography elicited strong feelings of dread, anxiety, skepticism, and contempt from visual artists of the mid-19th century. Initially, the French sculptor Rodin believed that photography was a soulless medium, a technique for documentation of reality, useful for its precision, but devoid of soul. If the artist only reproduces superficial features, as photography does, if he copies the lineaments of a face exactly, without reference to character, he deserves no admiration. The resemblance which he ought to obtain is that of the soul. Rodin believed that photography's greatest strength as a documentary process was its greatest flaw as an art form, writing, "Mere exactitude, of which photography and life casting are the lowest forms, does not inspire feelings." Rodin would become an accomplished photographer in his own right, using his camera to document his sculptures and financially benefiting a great deal from selling prints of his photographs. But he never felt as though photography had developed into a mature art form in its own right within his lifetime. So I learned all this stuff back in college in the early 2000s, and back then it all seemed very silly to me. I was studying media arts, which included photography and cinematography, and to me it was very clear that photography was an expressive medium of human creativity. In the photographic process, we have to make all sorts of creative decisions, and no photograph is a perfect reproduction of reality. Decisions about lens length, shutter speed, aperture, and framing can dramatically alter the results of a photograph, and the editing process allows us to transform images in even more dramatic ways. Of course, photography is an art form. Back when I was in my early 20s, I thought artists like Delaroche and Turner were just ridiculous for decrying the death of painting in 1839. I thought Rodin was a bore for failing to recognize the humanity and the creative spark inherent in the photographic process. But today, in 2025, after technologies like large language models and generative AI have exploded into society in such a disruptive manner, the words of Delaroche and Turner and Rodin hit differently. I can see why there was so much anxiety and skepticism. I can understand the revulsion which early painters had at first laying eyes upon photographic portraits. It must have been uncanny to see an image that was reproduced through a chemical-mechanical process with such precision. Painters who had spent decades perfecting techniques for capturing a human figure on the canvas must have felt challenged, even insulted, by the fact that flawless reproductions of human faces can now be generated at the snap of a shutter button. I think these painters were right to fear the photograph, but they feared it for the wrong reason. Art is never going to die, at least not as long as there are humans who have thoughts and feelings they wish to share with the world. The photograph never posed a threat to art. The anxiety which those painters felt was the anxiety of workers who understood on an intuitive level that the camera threatened their livelihoods. And indeed, cameras put a lot of painters out of work and drove down wages for workers involved in image reproduction, just as the camera increased profits for capitalists who exploited the technology to make their workforce more productive.
Did the camera actually kill art? Well, no. Did it kill portraits? Yeah.
In this sense, cameras and AI technologies are much the same. They are technologies that can and should benefit human artists by giving us new ways of imagining and expressing ourselves. The problem is not with the technology, but with the political economy of capitalism. Under capitalism, photography threatened and diminished the role of the painter. Under capitalism, generative AI threatens and diminishes the role of the writer and the artist, economically. As Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. Here, Marx refers to alienation. Capitalism alienates us from our art by cheapening our art making into commoditized labor that exists only to be bought and sold for the profit of a capitalist. Capitalism alienates us from the means of production, from the fruits of our labor, from our labor itself. But because we don't understand the nature of our own oppression, we get confused. We come to believe that art itself is dying, when art is not dying. It's being exploited and stolen and restrained and stifled beneath the chafing yoke of profit-seeking. How can I judge these artists for their anxiety and disgust when I myself feel that same anxiety and disgust every time I see an AI-generated image pop up on social media, every time YouTube feeds me a video that was obviously written by AI, squawked out to me by the artificial voice of a person who never lived?
Coal is the black blanket of this city.
I find myself having the same knee-jerk reaction to ChatGPT and Midjourney that Della Roche and Turner had to the photographic process. This is the end of art. I'm glad I had my day. That quotation just resonates so much differently now at the age of 41 than it did back in 2005 when I was 21. It doesn't seem so silly anymore. It may well be the case that large language models and generative AI have disrupted intellectual and creative labor more than any previous technology. Until our present era, intellectual laborers have been far more insulated from the negative impacts of automation than manual laborers. Previous innovations in technology which have directly impacted intellectual labor have tended to have positive or more neutral impacts on intellectual fields of labor. Fortunately for human artists, the advent of photography did not kill art. On the contrary, cameras and photographic reproduction technologies led to an explosion of new opportunities for creative work in human society. Yes, painters were put out of work, but the new job of photographer was born. The key difference between photographic technology and generative AI is that cameras cannot perform a generative function. Even with all the modern features of auto exposure, autofocus, image stabilization, and even with software innovations like beauty filters, skin smoothing, object removal, and so on, a human being must, at the end of the day, point the camera at a subject. A human being must make the essential decisions about what to include in the frame, what not to include, and how to present the final photograph. The camera cannot decide what to shoot, when to push the shutter button, what to crop out, and what to publish. Generative AI is fundamentally different because it is capable of generating intellectual and creative output with relative autonomy. That is to say, the human mind is minimally involved with the decisions being made in the creative output of a system like DALL-E or ChatGPT. This creates the illusion that generative AI systems are performing labor. They are not. What these systems do in reality is facilitate the theft of labor on a grand scale. Before this point can be further explained and developed, I want to make it clear. I am not anti-technology. As an artist, I've always been at the forefront of technology. I've always been a tech geek. I got into digital video in the 90s when most students were still shooting film. I've always tried to stay on the cutting edge of innovations in photography and cinematography and audio engineering, and I use a lot of machine learning in my creative workflow. I use AI to filter noise, to at least try to clean up mistakes I made when shooting, and to patch over mistakes I made doing voiceover. I've done a lot of experimenting with large language models, and there are a few applications where I've found them useful. For instance, sometimes I can only half remember a quotation from something I read months or years ago, and LLMs are fairly good at helping to source them, especially since Google has become so in-shitified. But I'm also keenly aware of the limitations on these technologies. For example, in this line, I've used AI to patch over the word patch. And you probably wouldn't notice it if you weren't looking for it.
But if I use AI to try and reproduce an entire sentence like this one, it starts to get a lot more obnoxious and unnatural.
Of course, the technology is always improving and advancing, and I keep up with those things. I want to have good tools to make my job easier. And I also want to avoid using technology inappropriately. When it comes to using LLMs for research, hallucinations are rampant even with the latest AI models, so I have to double check every single scrap of information they provide against primary sources. And when it comes to reasoning and critical thinking, in my experience, LLMs are just laughably bad. You could get the same results from a magic 8-ball or a deck of tarot cards, arguably better results for that matter.
Is it ditech.com? Oh no!
And that should come as no surprise. LLMs are not truly capable of reasoning or critical thinking. It's just not in the purview of these technologies, no matter how much the corporate hype team wants to claim otherwise.
Our AI can talk to everybody on Earth, and we can learn the collective value preference of what everybody wants. I am hopeful that AI can help us be wiser, make better decisions, can talk to us, and if we say, hey, I want thing X, rather than the crowd spin that up, AI can say, hey, totally understand that's what you want. If that's what you want at the end of this conversation, you're in control, you pick, but have you considered it from this person's perspective, or the impact it'll have on this people? I think AI can help us be wiser and make better collective governance decisions than we could before.
What could possibly go wrong?
Now that could change, or maybe I'm wrong. Really, that doesn't matter for the purposes of the discussion we are having here. My point is, I'm not saying that we should absolutely under no circumstances ever use these technologies, but we do need to be thoughtful about how we use them. And even more importantly, we need to understand what these emerging technologies mean for us as workers, as part of the working class. How does AI fit into the system of capitalism? How are these technologies being used to further exploit us, to weaken us, to enrich and strengthen the ruling class? With these questions in mind, let's now review some basic terms and concepts that will be useful in this analysis. Labor in general must be defined along with the specific nature of intellectual labor. The role of labor and the role of automation technology within the capitalist system must be understood. And finally, we must distinguish where generative AI and large language models fit into this complex equation. To begin with, labor is conscious activity which is performed by human beings to impact and change the world. Activity which is not consciously performed is not labor. A colony of honeybees might work to build a hive and to produce honey, but they did so instinctively. An assembly line robot might perform 1,000 acts of welding or riveting or cutting or stitching per hour, but it does so thoughtlessly. As Marx wrote in Capital, a spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this: that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. At the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. And Marx distinguished between labor as conscious activity and the mindless activity of machinery for an important reason. Under capitalism, only human labor can produce profits. And such profits are created through a process which Marx called Verwertung, which is commonly translated into English as valorization. Valorization is a sort of economic alchemy whereby a capitalist transforms a sum of money into a greater sum of money. Profit valorization is at the simplest level a process of buying commodities and then selling those same commodities off at a higher price. But not just any commodity can be valorized in the marketplace. For instance, a barrel of oil purchased at market prices can only be sold at market prices. One might try to time the purchase and sale of oil on the market to try and get more funds than were initially invested, but this is a little more than gambling. And on a long enough timeline, it's not going to lead to significant wealth accumulation. As Marx puts it in Capital, the condition of the problem is that both sellers and buyers are on an equal footing and that they exchange equivalent for equivalent. The only commodity which can be valorized into significant profits is the commoditized labor of human beings. A capitalist is able to steal labor value from workers by paying them far less than their labor is worth. This is, according to Marx, the only source of profits for capitalists. This is because capitalists can exploit humans in a way that they can't exploit other commodities or things such as machines, robots, etc. Non-labor assets and commodities must be purchased at the market rate and sold or used at the market rate. If a capitalist wishes to purchase a machine, they have to pay roughly the same price as their competitors for that machine, and competition forces will drive down prices until capitalists are on equal footing. Human labor is different because the value of human labor can be stolen by capitalists. As Marx puts it, the value of labor power and the value which that labor power creates in the labor process are two entirely different magnitudes. And this difference of the two values was what the capitalist had in view when he was purchasing the labor power. The reason capitalists hire workers to do work is so that they can make profits off of that work. Under capitalism, a worker can be paid significantly less than the value of the worker's labor. A human laborer might produce $50 per hour in value for an employer, but the employer will only pay the worker $25 per hour in wages. The $25 difference is stolen labor value, and this is the source of profits for capitalists. Compare this to a robot.
What's a robot?
If it costs a capitalist $25 an hour to maintain and operate a robot, the capitalist can't valorize any more than $25 per hour from the robot's activities. And that's because the capitalist competitors can purchase and maintain the exact same robot for the same amount of money. You can't steal from a robot, nor can you significantly overcharge customers for the work performed by a robot. Only human labor leads to profits because only human laborers can be paid less than their value on the open market. This is admittedly a simplification of Marxist formulation of the labor theory of value and the valorization of profit, but it should hopefully be sufficient to help us understand that artificial intelligence at its current level of development cannot be said to be performing labor. ChatGPT is not conscious. ChatGPT lacks subjective will. ChatGPT cannot be exploited for profits. The work performed by ChatGPT cannot be valorized. What automation technology can do is make a human laborer more productive.
Can you perform labor?
I can perform physical labor, but I can help with mental labor. If you're doing physical work and want help thinking through it, I can absolutely assist.
Oh my God! He admitted it!
Tools and machinery and automation technology can't perform labor, but they can increase the amount of labor which a single human worker can perform. A worker with a chainsaw can chop down exponentially more trees than a worker with a simple hand axe.
A pox on your axe, Al!
Similarly, a technical support center which utilizes AI might be able to handle exponentially more support tickets than one which does not utilize AI. To say that automation replaces labor is therefore inaccurate. It's more accurate to say that automation displaces labor by allowing fewer workers to perform more labor in a shorter amount of time. This destabilizes and debases the worker and weakens the working class over time. As Marx explained, the worker becomes poorer the more wealth he produces. The more his production increases in power and size. The worker becomes an even cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. We also need to be able to distinguish between regular labor and intellectual labor. Intellectual labor is just a form of labor defined here in this awesome book on historical materialism that you should check out. Intellectual laborers are workers who are exploited for profit by capitalists and earn wages by laboring primarily through mental activity. This distinguishes them from most laborers who work by directly operating the means of production. They should also be distinguished from intellectuals in general, which are human beings who perform labor in the realm of human and social consciousness. Any human being who works to develop, disseminate, and interpret ideas can therefore be considered an intellectual, and intellectuals serve a wide variety of roles in human society, including writers, artists, journalists, teachers, medical physicians, lawyers, and so on. So all intellectual laborers are intellectuals, but not all intellectuals are intellectual laborers. What makes you an intellectual laborer is if your intellectual labor is being exploited for profit by a capitalist. Another important factor we must consider here is the embodiment of labor value. Commodities which are produced by human beings can be said to embody the labor value of the humans who produced, refined, built, and develop them. For example, if human workers must collectively labor for 1,000 hours to produce a machine, that machine can be said to embody all of that labor. And that labor value will be passed along into the market. If you buy an apple, you aren't just paying for the soil and water and sunlight that the tree consumed to produce the apple. You aren't just paying for the gasoline and the machinery and the other costs associated with growing and harvesting and transporting the apple. You're also paying for all of the embodied human labor that went into producing and delivering the apple to your grocery store. This is a critical aspect of large language models and generative AI. These technologies contain an absolutely enormous amount of embodied human labor value. Much of this labor was appropriated as wage labor. Huge teams of programmers and testers and data specialists have to expend thousands and thousands of hours to develop an AI system, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. These systems also embody the labor of countless intellectual laborers whose work can be found within the data sets which are mined and exploited to make a generative AI system function. Millions of books, blogs, articles, scripts, research projects, and other works have been accumulated and compiled into data sets to make ChatGPT and Gemini and Grok. And this embodied labor value has been appropriated without any sort of compensation or even consent from the intellectual laborers who produced those works. The same can be said for the millions of images produced by painters, photographers, illustrators, filmmakers, and other artists to create the data sets which are utilized by image-generating AI systems. This goes beyond ordinary processes of labor value theft typified in the wage system of capitalism. This is primitive accumulation on a grand scale. Marx defined primitive accumulation as the direct appropriation of the means of production from workers, which takes place through overt plunder and appropriation. Whereas the wage system underpays workers for labor, primitive accumulation withholds compensation altogether. Primitive accumulation transfers means of production directly to capitalists so that they can command and control production processes and withhold both the means of production and the benefits of the production process from the workers to whom they rightfully once belonged. A data set as a compendium of countless hours of human labor constitutes a means of production which capitalists have seized and appropriated through overt theft. Embodied in these means of production is more than just intellectual property of writers and artists and researchers. These data sets embody millions of hours of human labor which has been appropriated without even a pittance of wages. This makes the advent of generative AI the largest instance of the wholesale theft of intellectual labor value in human history, and by a very wide margin. The key problem of generative AI, therefore, from the perspective of the working class, is the problem of stolen labor value and the primitive accumulation of means of production. This is a much bigger problem than the mere theft of intellectual property. If we consider the social and economic problems of generative AI merely in terms of property, then we are using a framing which has a bourgeois and petty bourgeois class character, and we are limiting the discussion of matters which are of greater concern to the owning class. And by the way, capitalists are always going to win property disputes under capitalism.
I drink your milkshake. I drink it up!
By properly conceiving of the social and economic problems of generative AI in terms of stolen labor value and primitive accumulation, we are using a framing which has a proletarian class character, and we are properly identifying the nature of the harm and damage which is being committed against countless intellectual laborers. The essential problem isn't that writers and artists are having their property stolen, though that is of course a problem. The essential problem is that writers and artists are having their labor value stolen without compensation or consent. And this stolen labor value is being converted into a means of production which is then being withheld from workers and used to displace workers, further strengthening the capitalist class while weakening the working class. This elevates the issue of generative AI from a paltry problem of property theft to a grander and more pressing concern of class warfare. Workers must be made to understand that this goes beyond piracy or data theft. This is a power grab by which capitalists are seizing means of production away from us and using them against us to build their own wealth and power in this new venue of intellectual manufacture. Only by properly realizing process of labor and the role which automation technologies play in the process of labor and profit accumulation can workers be empowered to resist and fight back against this newly developed and higher form of capitalist thievery. Class consciousness is a prerequisite to class struggle, and intellectual workers must understand the nature of our own oppression if we're to have any hope of seizing back command over our own labor, the means of intellectual production, and yes, the fruits of our labor. The works of art, which we create through our uniquely human attributes of passion, of creativity, of subjective will. In portraits, Rodin often posed with hammer and chisel in hand, but Rodin did not chisel his statues out of stone himself. His practice was to mold his works in clay and then have them cast in metal, or to pay workers to reproduce his clay sculptures in marble or stone. Did this cheapen Rodin's work? Was it an exploitative practice for Rodin to pay the fellow who wielded the chisel far less than what he could command for selling the final result? These are not questions of property, but of labor. It is the labor we invest in art as artists that gives us such feelings of intimacy and deep connection to our works. Most artists would likely bristle at the framing of their work as mere property. Surely a painter's painting, a sculptor's sculpture, an author's novel is more than a piece of property. A work of art is an embodiment of emotional and intellectual labor. Commodification of art is hardly a new phenomenon, and reduction of great works of art to mere stores of value for speculation and investment has been a problem for a very long time. As artists, then, we mustn't allow the ruling class to frame the problems related to generative AI merely in terms of property. It is the labor of the artist that is being exploited and mechanically duplicated by LLMs and image generators. And it is our labor and these emerging means of production that we must demand ownership of. Art is more than property, and the process of art making is a process that must belong to the artist. This is where art and politics intersect. As artists, as intellectual laborers, we will not have true freedom of expression until we come to collectively own the means of artistic production and reproduction. As Marx wrote, the aim of capital is not to minister to certain wants, but to produce profit, and it only concerns itself with the production of articles as a means to this end. This is what art is reduced to more and more over time under capitalism, a means through which the ruling class can profit. Your passion, your creativity, your energy, your art is reduced to property and then stolen away from you without your knowledge or consent. And there is no solution to this problem under capitalism. The only solution is the liberation of human labor, of human intellect, an end to class society, and only communism and communist revolution can provide this lasting solution to the problem of stolen artistic labor. If you found this video interesting, we have a couple of books here which you might enjoy. This is our curriculum of dialectical and historical materialism. And we're making the ebooks available for free. These are the philosophical frameworks which we use in our analysis here at NonCompete, and I think they are invaluable for artists in particular to understand how we fit into the system of capitalism and why we as artists should dedicate our artistic talents and labors to social revolution. Oh, and by the way, Part 3 on political economy will talk about alienation, theft of labor value, and a whole lot more. The books were originally in Vietnamese, and you can support my partner Luna's translation efforts and help make the ebook free under Creative Commons when it comes out in a couple of years over at givebutter.com/political economy. If you have any questions, you can leave them down in the comments, and if you'd like to support our work, you can check out our Patreon. We even have a free tier if you're a starving artist who can't afford a subscription. And if indeed you are an artist, I would love to hear what you think. Has generative AI threatened your livelihood? How can we use art to resist and struggle against capitalism? Are there valid ways of using this new AI technology to produce art? Let me know down in the comments. I'm EJ. Thanks so much for watching. Take care of each other. We'll see you next time.